Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to our monthly webinar here with the Building Decarbonization Learning Accelerator. If you are not familiar or just getting to know the BDLA, we're a project of Stanford University where we're making teaching tools and information on building decarbonization available to professors around the U.S. and internationally. We also have a wide variety of public and private sector folks that are taking advantage of the teaching tools and information that we have made available. We have a website, bdla.stanford.edu, where this webinar and other webinars have been recorded and are posted there. We have teaching tools that include slide decks, reading materials, exercises, case studies, and a wide variety of material that you can download for free, incorporate into your courses as you see fit. And we have over 200 universities that are already taking advantage of this material. And so we urge you to do the same. Today, we have a speaker from Stanford, and we like to help highlight some of the amazing work that's going on at Stanford, but also around the country and internationally. But today we're going to be talking with one of Stanford's leading people that is thinking about climate policy and building decarbonization and how to integrate those two. Michael Wara is a lawyer, scholar, and advisor focused on sustainability policy. He's the director of the Climate and Energy Policy Program and a senior research scholar at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. He is also the senior director of policy within Stanford Sustainability Accelerator, where he connects Stanford students and faculty with cutting-edge policy debates on climate, energy, and sustainability to craft real-world solutions to these challenges. Previously, he was an appointee to the California Wildfire Commission, served on the California Catastrophe Response Council, advised the California Senate, the California Public Utilities Commission, and the California Office of Electric Infrastructure Safety on strategies to address the wildfire crisis. We thought it would be great to have Michael talk today a little bit about what the policy solutions for full-scale decarbonization, what that's going to look like over time, and some of the challenges that he's seen in getting there. So he's got a lot of deep experience in thinking about how this is all going to unfold. I'd urge you to listen carefully, but also ask thoughtful questions. And I'm sure Michael will challenge you and provoke some very interesting thoughts. So, Michael, thank you for taking the time. Michael is very busy, has a lot going on, and so we're really appreciative of him spending the time with us today. Thank you, Michael.
Peter, Lindsay, thank you both for the invitation, and it's a real pleasure to get to talk about this topic. It's one that I've been working on in various ways. I was sort of reflecting as I was getting ready to think, I prepare to present today about when did I first start thinking about building decarbonization? And the answer really is commuting home on a day in 2010. I live north of San Francisco, and so I drive up 280 and down 280 very frequently. And I was driving home, and it looked as if an aircraft had crashed into the hill above San Francisco International Airport. And what actually had happened is that a 30-inch gas main had exploded under a neighborhood. And the San Bruno gas explosion ultimately killed, I think it was about 24 people. It just devastated, a community, a neighborhood in San Bruno. And in the aftermath of that gas explosion, as the behavior, the O&M, the operations and maintenance behavior of PG&E really became more visible, and really drew scrutiny. I think it really began an era of enormous investment in the gas system in California, which is really still continuing to today, where the gas utilities have been investing heavily in order to not kill people with their systems. And, run the clock forward a few years. Folks may remember that there was a well blowout at a gas storage facility in Southern California operated by SoCalGas. And that led to a second round of investments. I was on the CCST panel evaluating safety in the gas storage system and really the need for the gas storage system in the aftermath of the Aliso Canyon well blowout and the harm that was caused to neighborhoods around Aliso Canyon, where what had really been an old oil reservoir, right, where the oil had been taken out, the oil was depleted, and then it was flipped around and being used as a gas storage facility where you had a well blowout. And again, practices. I remember vividly a guy who was also on our panel, this report we did for CCST, who was from the Permian, who was like an oil and gas well drilling consultant, really one of the recognized experts. And he came out to California and was looking at the practices in the gas storage system and just couldn't believe it. He could not believe that so many corners had been cut in order to save money in ways that really led directly to Aliso Canyon. And then after Aliso Canyon required enormous investment in the system, in the storage facilities, especially in Southern California, in the load pocket down there, and also in Northern California in the Delta. There's a PG&E facility in the Delta, which you would never know it if you don't know where to look, but behind a levee, there is a very significant energy facility that without which Northern California could not function. Um, so looking at those investments, being a part of the kind of the set of people that were developing California's climate policies. A couple of years after that, I'm at a meeting organized by the state at UC Berkeley Law School, and Carla Peterman, who at the time was a PUC commissioner, had been an energy commissioner prior to being on the PUC, is speaking about and speaking about in kind of a congratulatory frame about the enormous amount of investment in the gas system that was occurring at the time. Billions of dollars being poured into making the system safe. And I raised my hand and I said, "Hey, Carla," she's a friend. She's still a friend, a wonderful person. Now she runs government affairs for PG&E. Hey, Carla, isn't all this money going to be a stranded asset? For those who don't know, who don't speak, utility law language, what a stranded asset means in this context is that, utilities earn a return on investments they've made in their systems that are used and useful. That means they're being employed to provide service to customers. They aren't allowed to earn a return on investments that they have to throw away because they're useless. So I said, "Hey, Carla, you just told me how we're investing. I forget what the right number is, something on the order of $15 billion in the gas system, a huge increase in the investments that are necessary to have a safe system. But also, we have this climate target." This was in the time of Governor Brown, where Governor Brown, toward the end of his term, via executive order and then ultimately by statute, introduced the idea of California being net zero by 2045 as a state. And I said, how is it okay that we're spending $15 billion, dollars, 20 billion, whatever it is, this very large amount of money, um, making the gas system safe when we all know that gas system assets that are put in the ground are supposed to last 40 years. I look at my watch and it's like 2018, 2017. And we're supposed to be net zero by 2045, which means all these assets are not going to be used and useful, right? All these investments we're making in gas storage facilities, in the last mile, the distribution system and transmission system pipelines that were unsafe circa 2010, and the San Bruno blowout could have happened in a lot of places, right? What we discovered was that everybody had been cutting corners for decades in order to save money on customer bills and not investing in the system. And so the system was unsafe. Um, and then the same was true at the storage facilities. So like, and Carla sort of thought about it, and she's like, yeah, probably. And that, for someone who is a student of utilities and utility regulation, is a really scary thought because that amount of money, that's like throwing away several nuclear power plants worth of money. It's enough to really impact people's day-to-day lives. It's enough to really impact um, the viability of kind of cost-effective provision of energy services to people. And I think and from where I sit, we need to provide energy that is affordable to everyone in California. That is part of the social contract. And you know, you don't need to look very hard to see that we're struggling to do that today, mostly on the electricity side, but I actually think that the gas side is becoming more and more problematic with time, because of the need to invest in this kind of system deferred maintenance in the system. But that started me down a road of thinking like, how do we manage this contradiction? The contradiction between the need to provide affordable energy services to all Californians, not just the rich people, not just the people like me, who get to live in relatively nice houses and for whom energy bills are an annoyance, but not a household crisis. Um, but also the people that are struggling to live in California at all, right? The people that are leaving for lower cost states because they cannot afford the price of California. And at the time, the Energy Commission was starting down a path of thinking about this question, as well as a coalition of local governments. And I was fortunate enough to be invited into the room. So the strategy sessions at the beginning mostly took place at City of Berkeley kind of headquarters. People may be familiar with the City of Berkeley lawsuit around the issue of fixtures in buildings, like banning gas pipes in buildings as part of building code, as a way to sort of start to push toward electrification, and that was preempted by the Energy Policy Act 2005. We were sort of having these early conversations and trying to think about what are the strategies, what is preempted, and actually I still think that case was decided wrongly, but I'm just some schmo, and the judge gets to decide in the end. Um, but what could we do to push toward decarbonizing the building sector, or I think of it as kind of, because I come out of climate policy and think about cars a lot. I think of a fleet of buildings, of building stock, and we need to think about how we decarbonize different components of the fleet. Um, the but as much and what became very apparent to me and has really shaped my thinking and my team's work on this, and I would just emphasize this was really a team effort, and that ultimately the work that we did on building decarbonization policy was really, I was kind of in the back seat, and various younger folks on my team really led. Um, was how do we do this equitably? How do we do this in a way that meets low-income Californians where they actually are in terms of the challenges they face with housing, the challenges they face with affordability, and what does that mean for the pace and scale of building decarbonization? And so we very quickly kind of concluded that the only way out of this was to focus on um, the utilities and the utility network infrastructure as a key kind of place where decisions would get made or not made. And the reasons for that, kind of, I always used to say my mom, I'll just use my mom as the example in this story. My mom lives in San Francisco. She has one of those really fancy Wolf stoves. She loves her life is cooking and gardening. Those are the things she loves. And I have long tried to convince her that she should get an induction cooktop. And now you can get a Wolf induction range, right? So you can be just as fancy and sort of conspicuously consume in your kitchen, but do it with induction. I have not been successful so far in that crusade, that little personal family crusade. Um, but the problem that the utilities face is that they are a special kind of company in in a legal and economic sense. Um, the I'll start with the legal, and then I'll talk about the economic. Um, Legally, utilities get something and give something up in their business model. What they get is an exemption from antitrust law. So now you may say, well, I just heard about that Google decision, and what the hell? Who cares about antitrust law, right? But utilities are kind of they are state chartered monopolies. Their state law says only one utility is going to provide service within its service territory, and it can do all kinds of things to exclude other people from providing that service. Historically, that has meant, well, the historic justification for this was avoidance of waste, right? Having two sets of gas pipelines in the street, having two sets of electric wires, distribution wires. In the early days of electricity, especially, this was a big problem where you'd have like three different electric companies competing to provide service to every single house on a street. And that meant you had to have three sets of distribution wires, and it was a big mess, and nobody knew whose wires was whose, and it was ugly and dangerous. And so the and I should say, like with network infrastructure like this, just like network infrastructure like search or like credit cards, there are economies of scale. There are network externalities where the more customers you can hook up to your network, the cheaper it is to provide service to those customers. And so there is at least the idea, and I think it's reasonable to question this idea in practice, but that there's a natural monopoly, right? That if you allow competition to play out, what you're going to get is a single provider anyway in the end. Um, so long ago, the state recognized this, not California first, but states recognized this, and they crafted exemptions to antitrust law, anti-monopoly law, that said for particular kinds of businesses, we're not going to enforce the antitrust laws, and instead we're going to impose very intrusive regulation on those businesses. And so what that means is really that the quality of service is regulated somewhat, but more importantly, the amount of money that the business can earn is regulated. So utilities are allowed to earn a certain amount of money on their invested capital, their rate base, so-called. Typically in California these days, it's about 10 and a quarter% on rate base. That's called return on equity. Um, and in exchange for that exemption from antitrust, they have a guarantee of a return on their invested rate base. But, and this is a really important but in the gas and building decarbonization context, they have to serve all customers. They have an obligation to serve every customer that wants service within their service territory. So what that means in practice, let's go back to my mom. Let's say I convince my mom that she should have a Wolf induction range. Um, maybe they have gas, hot water, and heat as well in their 1920s era San Francisco home. Um, but let's assume we electrify the home and PG&E takes away the gas meter because there's no reason to have it anymore. Um, And eventually, because I'm of a certain age and my parents are definitely of a certain age, let's say they move into assisted living and we sell a house. Um, Someone else moves in. They can say to PG&E, we want gas service. And PG&E has a legal obligation to provide service. Now, it used to be that the cost of making the connection to the gas main in the street was kind of shared between the individual customer and all the other existing customers. So there was sort of a cross subsidy from existing customers to new customers in terms of the gas hookup. Now the new customer would have to pay the full cost. That's a recent change that the PUC made a few years ago, which I think is really important. Sort of the systemic changes are really important in this context. But still, there's this legal obligation that PG&E has to provide service. Now think about the problem that occurs if it's not just my mom. What if it's an entire neighborhood? What if College Terrace in Palo Alto decides we're getting rid of our gas service because we are green and we want to eliminate, we want to be a carbon neutral neighborhood. And so they say to PG&E, or actually, this would actually be Palo Alto Municipal Utilities, but they say we're going to electrify all the buildings. We're going to invest and upgrade the distribution system, the electric distribution system, so we can do that. And we're going to, in 5 years, we're turning off the gas. Maybe they leave the pipes in place, maybe they don't, who knows? But no more gas service. Um, and then, say 2, 3, 5 years later, somebody sells a house, somebody new moves in, and they say, I want gas service. What happens then? Right? That was the problem that all the utilities in this era were really thinking hard about. This is sort of in the late 2010s, pre-COVID, in the before times, and actually probably in the before the wildfire times when a lot of these utilities got busy with other things like not going bankrupt, or going bankrupt and getting out of bankruptcy. Um, but the the challenge there, was like, how do we relieve utilities of an obligation to serve certain parts of their service territory, right? If we were to move in a cost-effective direction on along a building and decarbonization trajectory, the cost-effective thing to do is actually to turn off neighborhoods. It's not to electrify individual houses. Because if you electrify an individual house, what that means is the people remaining on the system, and I assume that y'all have talked about this in the past, but what will happen is that fewer and fewer houses have to pay for the pipes in the street and the maintenance of the pipes in the street and the maintenance of a safe system. If the network stays the same size, but there are fewer customers on the network, it's the opposite of a network externality. It's like and the cost to serve are going to go up for each customer. And we looked at that and we said, that strategy would be problematic because the people that are going to be who's going to be left on the system. Well, we need only look at energy efficiency policy to understand who, right? It's going to be renters. It's going to be people living in multi-unit buildings. It's going to be low-income people who live in low-quality housing. And the folks in the nice parts of Palo Alto are going to electrify, maybe individually, and they're going to leave the people in the people that are low income, maybe that live around them, maybe in the apartment buildings, kind of on the hook to pay for gas, and those people may not even have any control over their building because a landlord owns it. Um, and so we started to look into this issue, and what we found was that there are really interesting examples of relieving utilities of an obligation to serve. We published a couple, or really one paper by Amanda Zerbe, which you can still look up on our website if you're interested, that became kind of the heart of the policy conversation around this issue. Um, and um, what Amanda found is that there are examples from history where we have relieved utilities of obligation to serve. The simplest one to think about is, it used to be that it was pretty hard to build bridges across big rivers or things like the Golden Gate, right? Especially bridges at Tidewater are really tough engineering challenges. And then, imagine there's a famous old chestnut of a law case about the Charles River Bridge. So that was a bridge that was built across the Charles River between, Boston and Charleston in the late 1700s. And at the time, it was the only bridge at Tidewater on the East Coast, because on the East Coast, you also have to deal with ice, right? So you're trying to build a bridge that will survive tidal forces, wave forces, and ice in the winter. And that's actually like kind of hard. Um, so, instead of bridges, the way people got across bodies of water in the old days was ferries. Well, once you build a bridge, there's this other way to get across the water called a car, or even better, the equivalent of a ferry, if you have a bridge, is a bus. And so there are many, many examples of ferries that were, and I should just say ferries were regulated as a kind of monopoly service in many contexts. Either they were publicly owned or the private ferries were given kind of a monopoly on a ferry crossing in order to incentivize, good service, reasonably priced, and also the ability to invest in like large boats without worrying about competition that would sort of drive you into, like mean that the service deteriorated, the quality deteriorated, and safety also deteriorated. Because like if you're on a boat, you want to worry a little bit about safety too. Um, and there are large numbers of cases where the ferry, the ferry company goes to the utility commission that's regulating it and says, "Hey, hold on a minute. You can't like let the buses use the bridge because then we won't be able to earn our return." And what the utility commissions did was to say, "You know what, ferry company, you're in the bus business too. And we're going to allow you to cease or reduce your ferry service and substitute bus service because that would actually be a more cost-effective way to provide the kind of thing, the service that you're actually delivering, which is transportation service, not ferry transportation." And so there is this model, and we think the model is actually applicable to the context of building decarbonization. Because what we're really talking about here, people don't care how the water gets hot. People don't care well, they care. My mom cares about how the food is cooked. She likes to see the little blue flame under her pot. But most people don't care. They want cooked food, they want hot water, they want a comfortable home to live in. That's the service. And whether the service is provided by electricity or gas is like an accident of history, an accident of, resource availability in particular places and technologies and the time at which particular communities were developed, right? You go to the Southeast, there's a lot less gas heating and a lot less gas hot water because the Southeast was built out more recently in the era of air conditioning. And so fully electric homes are just much more common in that area. Um, so there is this substitution of service issue. What we found that was really interesting was that we came with these legal arguments. We said, look, the Utility Commission in California has the legal authority to say electric service can substitute for gas service, and therefore you can say to customers in a neighborhood, we're turning off your gas, and we're gonna help you. In the meantime, we're gonna turn off your gas in 5 years, 10 years, whatever. And in the meantime, we're gonna have a really intensive process to make sure that everybody has electric appliances for when that last day comes. And what I tell you is we found a couple things. First thing is that utility commissions don't do those kinds of things without very clear direction from the governor and the legislature. Even if the legal authority is there, that does not mean that a commission will exercise its discretion to utilize that authority when the change under consideration is of sufficient magnitude, right? And this is a major change. This is saying, a line of business is going away for one of the central companies we regulate. In Southern California, in particular, this is a complicated issue because PG&E can have a transition strategy where their gas system slowly phases out and their electric business grows. In Southern California, we have SoCalGas and a number of electric utilities. And in that context, SoCalGas is going away as a company while the electric business of Southern California Edison and LA Department of Water and Power grows. So that's a much more and that gets you right into kind of the politics, right? So on the one hand, the commission, and I'll just relate one anecdote about this. A senior staffer who shall remain nameless forever, but was very forthcoming with me and my students, and I was really grateful. It was a great teachable moment for my students. She said to us, um, look, utility commissioners come and go. I'm here for my entire career. I've been here for 25 years. I'll be here for another 20. And there is no way on God's green earth that I'm going to sign off. I'm going to allow this to happen until I get a very clear signal from the governor and the legislature that this is what they want. Because commissioners don't matter in comparison. When you're talking about this kind of a change, right? Saying that this business is going to go away in a particular neighborhood with all the ramifications of that. So we took that and we said, okay, let's go get some legislation done, right? Like if what's needed is clear direction from the governor in particular, let's talk to the governor. We need to go up a level of politics, right? We thought we were in a regulatory conversation. We need to actually be communicating directly with the leadership of the state. Um, it was around the same time that the Energy Commission published a really helpful report on the future of gas that I think was controversial at the time, in particular because it said things which are, I mean, to my mind, completely reasonable. Like there is not enough um, renewable natural gas to meet current needs. And even if there is, it's super expensive. And so we shouldn't think about it as like this drop-in alternative to natural gas, which, now costs, I mean, it's been a long time, right? But it's basically $3 an MMBTU um, for Henry Hub. And, RNG contracts go at like $50 an MMBTU, maybe 25 if you're lucky. So factor of 10 to 20 more expensive. Um, so so we started to have those conversations, and a couple things. And at the same time, we received a very generous gift, or sorry, grant from one of the early grants from the Sustainability Accelerator at Stanford and I see some of my team members who are really a part of this early work are on the Zoom, and um, Moreldi Ahumena is still with us and working on a variety of things. Like she joined our team to think about the law and policy and technical issues associated with building decarbonization from an equity perspective, right? Working with low-income communities, particularly environmental justice communities in the East Bay, that we're starting to think about this issue in a more serious way. And we ran a series of like workshops and also did like these kind of intensive teaching practicums related to building decarbonization. And in close partnership with our EJ partners in the East Bay. And what we came to realize, like one thing we realized in the political process is that we were losing. SoCalGas was winning. And the way you win in the utility context, when we're talking about things like obligation to serve, is that you turn something that would be like a policy of general application into pilots. Pilots, there's a saying in utility land or utility commission land, death by pilot. And what that really means is that pilots take 5 years to do, and you do a few, and then you evaluate them for like 2 more years, and all of a sudden a decade has gone by before you actually do anything beyond like try things out in a few places. And SoCalGas was able to very effectively argue for the limitation of neighborhood scale decarbonization to a very small number of pilots. PG&E, to their credit, was much more collaborative and started a process in the East Bay to evaluate where to do building decarbonization and really centered equity in that discussion. They had a large number of stakeholders. I was on the stakeholder working group um, that really asked I think what was a really critical question at the time was where is it cost effective to do this kind of turn off networks, and but where do communities want it to happen? And those are both important questions, right? The answer to the cost effectiveness question is generally in like rich, low density suburbs. It's really expensive to provide gas to like, I don't know, Moraga. It's much more, or Danville, right? I'm talking like places in the East Bay that are relatively low density, suburban neighborhoods that tend to be pretty affluent. It is pretty cost effective to provide gas service to like downtown Oakland because you got lots of people, lots of customers concentrated in a place paying money every month to support the maintenance of that line in the street. But what do people want? That is also really important. And when the EJ community was brought into the conversation, they said, you know what? And you could think about this like in two ways. One is EJ communities have a long history of being like experimented upon in ways that are not good or fair. And so they might say, you know what? Like, you go figure that policy out in Danville and then come talk to us because we don't want to be your guinea pigs anymore. That was one hypothesis. The other hypothesis was they should get to go first because gas in buildings creates health issues, right? We know that like asthma is highly correlated with having a stove in your house. There's at least a correlation there that's pretty compelling. And we were starting to measure Rob Jackson and his team were starting to measure, the contaminants that were coming out of stoves for the first time, and we were realizing like this is really bad. And it's crazy that the vents over gas stoves aren't like automatically turning on and like sounding like a jet engine every time the gas stove is on because you're just like you have like an open fire in your house that's full of contaminants. And it's especially problematic as houses get more efficient because then they're well sealed to the outdoors and you're just like sitting in the soot and breathing it in. So whatever. The outcome was that the the EJ people partners really wanted to go first. They wanted to be a part of the leading edge of building decarbonization. So they became part of these PG&E pilots, and that was really like a focus in these small kind of block scale experiments. Um, but at the same time, SoCalGas in Southern California, because this issue was existential for them, right? If there's no gas service, there's no gas company providing that service. And that means the gas company shareholders are unhappy, was fighting quite effectively to block any law that would say it is the policy of the state of California that buildings need to decarbonize. And what that means is not some vague promise of future carbon neutral molecules going through the pipeline. It means getting rid of the gas system and electrifying the buildings and creating a legal pathway, legal direction, policy direction to the PUC and that staffer at the PUC that this is the position of the state of California. The other piece of this that we started to run into in our building decarbonization policy practicum was how this all interacts with the reality of housing for low-income people in California. So remember, or it's not even remember, it's still true, right? Gentrification is a huge challenge in communities, low-income communities in California. I'm old enough to remember when the Mission District was a place that was where Spanish was the first language. And you could not expect to walk into most of the stores or restaurants in the Mission District and be able to effectively communicate if you did not speak fluent Spanish. Um, that's obviously not true anymore, right? Hasn't been true for a long time. Um, the challenge that low income people were facing when confronted with building decarbonization was how to prevent gentrification of a neighborhood when when the reality was that the services provided by electric appliances, especially electric heat, like heat pumps, are much better. And when buildings were being converted, people typically were evicted, and when they wanted to come back, the rents were higher. And we did a number of reports. We were also kind of collaborating and speaking with a number of the people, um, the sort of housing and tenant advocacy groups that were focused on this issue. Like, how do we control gentrification? That was sort of challenge one. Challenge two was how do we um, manage cost, um, and not so much just the cost of the the energy upgrades that we were focused on, right? Getting natural gas out of buildings, but that a lot of these buildings, heat pumps work great in well-sealed buildings. If you've got a building that's super drafty because it's crappy construction from the 1960s that hasn't had proper maintenance, when you go to electrify the building, you're probably going to want to like think about that, improve the insulation in the building, improve the air seal of the building envelope. But when you do that, you also discover, oh, these older buildings have mold. And so there are just real challenges that relate more to the quality of the building stock as you electrify than necessarily to like the cost of, say, heat pumps for, as a replacement to a natural gas furnace. And so we started to encounter these challenges as well. Um, but I think at the same time, and I think this is a really important thread in all this, like reach codes were becoming a really big deal. And does that, I don't know if I don't totally know who my audience is here, but I'm just going to say like very, the gloss on a reach code is that a local government is allowed under California law to adopt a more stringent energy efficiency code and than the statewide standard. Um, and the local govs at the time were really pushing the idea of all electric buildings as the kind of standard for energy efficiency. And then if a contractor wanted to do something that wasn't electric, they would have to meet a more stringent energy efficiency code than Title 24. So there's sort of like you either could build all electric or you could have a super duper efficient building that was not all electric. And generally that made the all electric alternative cost effective. Um, so that's happening in new construction. Because Reach Code's code in general only applies to new build or substantial reconstruction of existing structures. Um, it doesn't require you don't have to bring your house that you're living in up to code each year as the code evolves. Um, so where does all this land? I think there are enormous unresolved challenges for the policy of building decarbonization. Where we are now, and the Building Decarbonization Coalition, which at the time was very effective in pushing this agenda, was able to get codes put in place that will effectively what they did was lower the standards on NOx emissions from electric hot water heaters and furnaces to the point where you kind of need to get rid of them. But within I think the date is 2030. I might be wrong about the year, but there is a coming deadline where standards will change in in a significant number of jurisdictions that would effectively make it very difficult to use natural gas to heat buildings or heat hot water in buildings. And so that happened, but we have not in California shown the political will because of, opposition from companies, also opposition from people. The gas companies were able to really politicize this issue and make it kind of a part of the climate culture war. Um, and I think until we are able to win that big policy fight, the trajectory we're on, unfortunately, is one where more affluent people like myself electrify their homes. And that means that the system gets, which has a constant cost, or maybe a cost that's escalating through time because of lots of reasons, that cost is being spread over a smaller and smaller number of homes that are going to tend to be occupied by low to moderate income Californians. And I see this as a real problem. I think it's not sustainable. And so the real question is, can we get to the rational policy outcomes we need to before the pain of that gets so intense that we have to backtrack from building decarbonization objectives? Um, I'm not sure where we're going to get because happening around this, the other thing that happens in this time, and the reason this is such a challenging issue in California now, in part, is that the cost of electricity went up by 100% because of wildfire. And so now we face a context where electricity prices are much, much higher than they were, which makes it harder and I should say, and there's a perception, I think it's not a reality, but there is a perception of a reliability problem. There are real reliability challenges for people who live in rural areas in California associated with wildfire, but kind of everybody thinks they have a reliability problem now, not just the people that live in the really high fire risk areas. And that kind of has been, I think, weaponized by advocates for natural gas. Um, but there is a less of an affordability benefit than there used to be by quite a bit because of the run up in electricity prices. And and at the same time, we're starting, we haven't managed to do the things that would allow the gas system to shrink. And I think like the right way to do this is not to decarbonize individual buildings, it's to shrink the gas system. That's the only way to do this affordably. And affordability is, if you work in the energy space in California, it's all you think about or talk about at this point. And so we really need to, I guess, thinking forward, thinking optimistically, the work of building decarbonization, I think, needs to recenter away from getting incentives for heat pumps. That's important. We need to make it affordable for people that want to switch, but or maybe focusing those incentives in a much more concentrated way where we identify places in the system that are cost effective to get rid of. Maybe they're going to need to replace the gas main in the street because it's from 1950, right? And that's the place where you focus all the incentives and you electrify everybody instead of replacing that gas main. And that is not a process that has really taken off yet. If it doesn't take off, I think that the future looks really problematic and really we're gonna enhance the inequity rather than reduce it. I think there's an opportunity here to reduce, but it requires a focus on the system level impacts. And with that, I'm going to stop and take questions and feedback, and I'd love both.
Yeah. Let me just jump in, and while people are formulating their questions, which you guys can do either by putting it in the Q&A or unmuting and asking the question. But I look forward to hearing about the future of your mom's cooking. And you can tell us when she does convert, because that will be a good sign, right? So, um, but I'm curious. I did want to also mention that we have Therese Peffer on this webinar today, and she did lead a webinar a couple months back about a neighborhood decarbonization project pilot in Oakland, which was really exciting and really interesting discussion where a whole neighborhood is going to be electrifying, and so the gas line on that street is no longer necessary. But I'm curious, Michael, in your discussions with people outside of California, is there anybody that has this right, either in the U.S. or abroad, that you've heard you go, wow, these guys are actually figuring this out correctly?
Well, I wouldn't want to pretend that I have like encyclopedic global knowledge of this issue. Let me just start there. But we are not, I am not aware of a utility regulator anywhere that's really taking this step at a system-wide level, right? And that's what we need to see. Like, I just want to say, like, those neighborhood pilots are super important, and I think it's great. And I think that all of the work that's gone into those is so valuable. But also, it's 2025, and we have 20 years if we take those goals seriously. And, the biggest intervention in homes, one other thing we looked for in our work was to look back in history and say, like, where have utilities gone into people's houses to change things before? Because, like, if we're going to electrify neighborhoods, the level of investment and engagement inside the house is kind of unprecedented, right? And the recent version of this, the biggest kind of house by house change that utilities made was the installation of advanced metering infrastructure, smart meters, that occurred in the kind of 2000s and early 2010s. But that's like the meter on the outside of the house. Last time people actually went into houses was the switch from town gas to natural gas that
Mhm.
occurred in the early 20th century. Ta town gas or manufactured gas is basically like a kind of natural gas made from coal that was used for lighting prior to um, and electricity, and it was phased out over time. But like there was a point at which everybody had all the burner tips had to be changed, or there was fire danger, and so the utilities actually went house by house and switched the burner tips. Um, like we need models for how to do that that we don't really have. Um, and so that's where the pilots are important. But also, I think we need to be honest that like this is a like
Yeah.
it has to happen at a scale that we just we haven't seen anywhere.
Yeah.
Um,
I had a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so please ignore, forgive my ignorance, but I'm a first year MPP student. And I was wondering, you mentioned at the end that we need to uh, shrink the gas system in order to ensure equity, while at the same time not electrifying uh, one building or buildings in isolation. How are these two different? Could you please clarify that?
of course, yes. And I apologize if I was not clear there. So imagine let's say we have money to electrify 100 homes in a community or 1,000 homes in a community of 10,000 people. Um, One option might be that we allow whoever within that community is interested to apply for the money and get the money and electrify their house. And we're going to end up with a randomly distributed collection of electrified homes across the community of 10,000. Another option, and that will mean in practice that we have to provide natural gas service to the entire community of 10,000 homes. So the cost of the gas system is the same, even though we've electrified 1,000 homes. Um, Another option would be we draw a square somewhere in that community and we electrify all the homes within that square. And we say, hey, if you live in that square, that little area on the map, we're going to turn off the gas service in 5 years. And therefore, and here we're going to show up with lots of subsidies and help and technical assistance to help you electrify your home. But there's no choice. This is coming. And at the end of that, you can actually abandon, you can turn off 1/10 of the gas system. So you've electrified 10% of the homes, 1,000 out of 10,000, and the gas system cost has shrunk by about 10%. And therefore, the cost to serve the other 90% of the customers is the same, right? You don't have, let's say the gas system costs $100, right? If you only have 90 customers left and you have to serve the same area, you're going each of those 90 customers has to absorb their share of that extra cost, right? But if you can shrink the gas system at the same time as you shrink the number of customers attached to the gas system, then the cost per customer remains stable. And it's pretty easy to show that there's sort of these, at the beginning, this is not a big deal. But as more and more people, if more and more people electrify at random, right? If you just say, here's a subsidy, anybody can get it, then what you're going to end up with is kind of in the long run, escalating natural gas costs that are really problematic for the people that haven't electrified. On the one hand, that strengthens incentives to electrify. So maybe that's okay. On the other hand, if you live in a place that you just can't electrify because you don't own the home, right? You're a renter, which probably a lot of people on this call are renters, right? A lot of people are, right? Most people are. Um, then um, it's a real problem. Um, the and so that's what I'm trying to get at, Mohammed. I hope that's more clear. Like imagine those two scenarios where you just sprinkle the electrification all around versus a really focused footprint along the lines of the East Bay pilots that Peter was just mentioning.
Great. There's
Yeah,
a
that clarifies a lot and resonates with one other policy problem, which is the adoption of NEM, where the costs are, you know, borne by the users who have not turned solar. So, although a different scenario, but in that case as well, the problem is that the customers not using the solar, they are paying for the grid charges.
Yes, it is analogous to NEM. The effects are analogous. I think it's a little bit different in the
Yes.
sense that um, in the gas context, the person that electrifies their building is not using the gas system anymore, right? So they're not like in the NEM context, people that are really against NEM will say, well, they're like freeloading or they're using the grid as like a free battery. They're taking advantage. These people who electrify their homes are not taking advantage of the gas system in that way. They're not using it for free and somehow getting away with it. Like they've disconnected. They're out. But there are system level effects of that. And the question that I'm addressing is what are the policy designs that avoid those system level effects, right? How do we have a policy to decarbonize buildings that is fair and equitable, given where we are now, given that we have a big gas system?
So I'd like
Right.
to,
Thank you.
yeah, I'd like to give Valerie Nibbler a chance to ask a question. Valerie, do you want to unmute and go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, really, really interesting discussion. I'm actually working right now on a California Energy Commission project, mindful gas decommissioning, developing a data-driven tool to help integrate equity to select census tracts that are promising for decommissioning. And there's, of course, currently a lot of discussion around Senate Bill 1221 and the selection of pilot sites. And part of what's novel about that approach is that it alleviates, for those pilot sites at least, the obligation to serve for the utilities. And yet the selection of these sites is, it's quite a lengthy process. I'm just interested in your thoughts. I didn't hear you mention that particular, those particular pilots. And I was just curious to see if that's on your radar and how you're thinking about that approach.
Well, so I think the 1221 is great in lots of ways, in the sense of creating a process for pilots. I think that is valuable. I guess where I worry is I think the reason that we're talking about pilots and not system-wide planning, like what we advocated for, and I think this was in original versions of 1221, was that the utilities needed to plan at a system level for this and develop a process where they would not select a few pilots, but they would plan for to decarbonize their entire system. Because what's going on around 12, not so much anymore, but what was going on around 1221 was a lot of random building decarbonization, right? We had the Inflation Reduction Act and a lot of state policy that was incentivizing like home retrofits sort of sprinkled across the network. And we were seeing before the repeal of Inflation Reduction Act subsidies, a lot of excitement and uptake about um, uh, heat pump deployment, which is good. This is just a complicated issue because we need to we need to balance the pace of deployment with deployment that is equitable. And Valerie, it sounds like you're working on the thing that I would support. I want to see that scale much faster, right? If we're going to do this, we need to be doing that faster than we are handing out subsidies for heat pumps to whoever walks in the door. That would be my perspective. And if I have a concern about 1221, it's that at the end of the day, SoCalGas was able to whittle it down enough so that it is a pretty limited, it's not wholesale building decarbonization. It's not wholesale gas network shrinkage, it's pilots. And I worry that, as you point out, the process is very complicated, it's very time consuming, and we're just not going to move fast enough to have this with, work at a scale where it can control gas system costs as people make their own decisions to buy or not buy heat pumps.
Great. So on that, we've run out of time. I think we could go on. This is super stimulating. And what I'd like to remind everybody is we're at the beginning of this big journey. Michael, you're thinking about how it's going to play out over the whole path. I love that. So I want to thank you for putting the time in today, sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you, Lindsay, for organizing everything. And I really would love to reconnect in a couple of years to see how the policy concepts have played out, because there's got to be a solution in there somewhere.
I
Um,
think there is too. I
yeah,
remain optimistic about this, but it is a hard path. And I think
yeah,
what we need to avoid is taking the easy off ramps that seem like wins that you can celebrate, with your NGO community or like, yay, we won, but actually are making the problem harder in the long run.
right. Exactly.
All right.
I also want to just let everybody know the two upcoming speakers. Next month, we're going to have Scott Shell, who works with Climate Works Foundation, and he's going to be talking about substitutes in cement. Cement being one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases worldwide, 7 to 8%. And he's specializing in this LC3 cement substitute, which is limestone, calcined clay cement. And it's really a very interesting thing, widely available, very affordable. And a lot of people are saying this is the direction we should be going in. So that should be good. And then in December, we have Rohan Parikh from Infosys in India, who's going to talk about the Infosys journey on reducing their corporate energy consumption by 50% over 40 million square feet of office spaces in India. And they really have cracked the code on super efficient buildings that are also affordable. So that should be very exciting webinar in December. So thank you everybody for joining today. Please visit our website, tell your colleagues about it. And again, thank you, Michael, for taking the time. Super appreciated it.